This is an incredible book. What we're dealing with is a prophecy in Zechariah. Okay, so this is probably written in about maybe 520 thereabouts, BC. Certainly a little bit more than 500 years before the birth of Jesus, and about 200 years before the conquest uh, of Alexander. Okay, so if you recall, let's take a look now in Daniel and just recall the order of the major kingdoms, the beasts. So let's take a look at Daniel chapter 7. Okay, and so at this point, when Daniel writes, Babylon is the great kingdom of the world. It is the first great empire. And Daniel had a dream and he saw this vision. And as he saw the vision, he saw four beasts. The first was like a lion with wings of an eagle. And then the second one the second beast looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides and it had three ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And then the third beast was one that looked like a leopard. And on its back, it had four wings like those of a bird. This beast had four heads, and it was given authority to rule. Now, when we get to the fourth beast, then the fourth beast has iron teeth, and it crushed and devoured its victims, trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. Okay, so the first beast is Nebuchadnezzar, his kingdom, the kingdom of Babylon. The second is when we look at the second beast, it's the combined kingdom of Medo-Persia. So it's the Medes and the Persians. Persians, of course, modern day Iranians are Persians. Um, and then you get to the third beast. And the third beast has certain characteristics. It's very fast. It's a leopard. Leopards are very fast. Leopards faster than bears. Less leopards are faster than lions. Um, and it had four wings, meaning it was even faster than that. And then it had four heads. Okay, so that is what's prophesied in Daniel. And then, of course, the final is the Roman Empire, which lasts in one form or another until the Lord's return. And we are still in, to some degree, the days of the Roman Empire. Now, if you question that, consider that um, we had so many who were Caesar over the years. In fact, as recently as in Germany, you had Kaiser Wilhelm. Well, Kaiser is just German for Caesar. And you have in the attributes assigned to the king or queen in England. There is mention of the Holy Roman Empire. And you saw that with Charlemagne. We speak a language that is predominantly from the Latin, which was the language of the Romans. Um, Roman law is the basis for much of our legal system. And I could go on, but the fact of the matter is, there are remnants of the Roman Empire, and the Western world has been um, really just an outgrowth of what Rome did. And we will see a rebirth of some aspect of the Roman Empire in the days before the Lord's return. Um, but today we're talking about the Greeks and the Greek Empire. And of course, that was Alexander the Great. So now let's go back to Zechariah and we'll see something very interesting. Okay, so here's Zechariah writing in the late 500s BC. And he says, the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach and will come to rest on Damascus. He's talking about Syria. For the eyes of all people and all the tribes of Israel are on the Lord, and on Hamath too, which borders on it, which borders on Syria, and on Tyre and Sidon. Okay, so now we're into Lebanon, though they are very skillful. Tyre has built herself a stronghold. She has heaped up silver like dust and gold like the dirt of the streets. So Tyre now was an island city. Now they had um, uh, some of Tyre was on the mainland, but the bulk of it was 1 kilometer off of Lebanon, out in the ocean. And it was a fortress. It was an incredible fortress, basically impossible to conquer, at least so it was thought. Plus, they had quite a navy, actually pretty powerful navy. Now, these were Persians there in Tyre, and this was really kind of the last major outpost with any power of the Persians in Tyre. Um, well, as you look at what's happening and the route coming down through the different cities, that is the route um, that Alexander took and swiftly went through these cities. Um, and so Tyre and Sidon, and then you get a little bit farther down and you run into Ashkelon and Gaza, and how it's prophesied that he's going to conquer all of this. And this discussion about all of this, but the Lord will take away her possessions, talking about Tyre, destroy her power on the sea, and she will be consumed by fire. Well, that's exactly what happened. Ashkelon will see it and fear. Gaza will writhe in agony. Ekron, too, for her hope will wither. Gaza will lose her king. Ashkelon will be deserted. These things happened. A mongrel people will occupy Ashdod, and I will put an end to the pride of the Philistines. I will take the blood from their mouths, the forbidden food from between their teeth. Those who are left will belong to our God and become a clan in Judah, and Ekron will be like the Jebusites. And you may remember the Jebusites actually were just settled. They were conquered but not destroyed and settled in Israel. But I will encamp at my temple to guard it against marauding forces. Never again will an oppressor overrun my people, for now I am keeping watch. So you just have this very interesting chain of events. And what I'd like to do is just discuss just a little bit about how a couple of these cities, the toughest ones to overtake, were really quickly overtaken by Alexander. It's hard to imagine, but in about 13 years, he conquered the known world. It's incredibly hard to imagine. He was a relatively young man. He died, I think he was in his early 30s. I think he might have been 33. His father, Philip of Macedonia, was a king in, of course, Macedonia and northern Greece, and he believed in diplomacy. Well, Alexander was raised by Aristotle, and he was taught by Aristotle, and he was imbued with a love of Greek culture. And a great deal of what he sought to do was to evangelize the Greek culture into the world. And so as he went, he set up schools to teach people Greek. His goal was not merely to conquer and control. His goal was to make the people Greek. Now, think of the Medo-Persian Empire or the Babylonian Empire. They didn't try to make the Jews Greek. They left them worshiping Jehovah. It wasn't a great problem to them. The Alexander, though, made the world Greek. And in doing so, he was preparing for the coming of the Messiah because everybody then spoke a single language. And so that single language was Greek. Now, they may have spoken their native language and probably did, but the lingua franca, the language of trade, was was Greek because everybody had been taught that. And it was a very, very good language. You could express things very precisely in it, far more precisely than in Hebrew, for example, where you have a lot of ambiguity in Hebrew because the words are made up typically of three letters, and then you add an ending and a letter perhaps in the beginning of the word to indicate who is, if it's a verb, who is performing the action, and the last letter or two will show what the object is, who the action is being performed on. Um, Greek was very precise, incredibly precise. Now, the siege of Tyre um, began in 332 BCE. That's how the theologians today would say it because they don't like to say BC, before Christ. So they say before the current era, which is really kind of a cop out. And um, of course, BCE is before the current era. And when did the current era start? When Jesus was born. Okay, so it's a crazy distinction. And then they would say current era, CE, where we would say AD, Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. Well, what is CE? It is the years after the birth of the Lord. So it's nuts. But so the prophecy here in the late 500s is prophesying something that's going to happen roughly 200 years later, not quite 200 years later. Well, um, the conquest of Tyre was one of Alexander the Great's most remarkable military achievements. The last really major outpost of the Persian Empire, and the island itself was heavily fortified, and it was a kilometer out to sea. So this is a really big strategic challenge for him to want to conquer. He could have just bypassed it, but he chose not to. He was concerned that he would have problems later if he bypassed it. So it was more or less in his path. So he decided he was going to conquer it. And it was a naval base, and he really didn't have a navy at that point. So that added another level of complexity. So you had the mainland settlement, and which was easy to conquer, relatively easy anyway, and this island fortress. And the city had extraordinarily high walls. It had this skilled navy. It had a strategic location. It was virtually impregnable. And at the time of the siege, there were probably 40,000 people or so, even after they had evacuated the women and children. They sent them to Carthage because they knew that a battle was coming. But they felt that they would be fine because they would be protected by their high walls, by their navy, by their distance out to sea, and so on. Well, Alexander wanted to conquer it not only to deny the Persians their last naval harbor, but also to ensure that he could dominate the entire Mediterranean trade routes. So his initial request to enter the city, he just said, I'd like to enter the city. Simple. And he said, I want to make a sacrifice at the temple of Melkart. And that, of course, was denied. But what Tyre did that really incurred his wrath was they killed his emissaries. That enraged him, and that triggered the siege. He might have bypassed them, or he might have entered into a peace agreement with them if they hadn't killed his emissaries, but they did. So, since he had no navy, he relied on a very interesting, very ambitious engineering solution. He built a causeway from the mainland out to the island. There was part of it, he was using a natural land bridge, but he was building in heavy seas at times, and he built it amazingly, and that allowed his siege engines and things like catapults and such And there were other ones as well for battering down doors. That enabled him to get these engines out there, um, and so that they could put up towers, ladders, catapults, and approach the walls. But the citizens of Tyre, the soldiers in Tyre, they set fire to his siege towers and they launched naval attacks against him. And that temporarily stopped some of the construction. Well, then Alexander had some very good fortune. Obviously, God was in charge. Um, 223 warships were contributed to him by the Phoenicians, who were not great friends of those in Tyre, and the king of Cyprus, who also was not a great friend of those in Tyre. And now he had naval superiority. So he blockaded their harbors and he continued his assault on the walls. And by this time, he had been able to get his troops across, his siege engines across, um, and they eventually were able to create a breach in one of the walls, and there was just this incredible coordinated attack from both land and sea. Now, nobody else had been able to successfully um, have a siege attack against Tyre. But once inside, Alexander's troops overwhelmed the garrison there, and they um, were able to pay them back for executing his captured soldiers. And so, according to the accounts, after that, around 8,000 Tyrians, if you will, were killed. 2,000 were crucified along the shore, and 30,000 women and children were sold into slavery. Now, I don't know how they got the women and children. All I know is that as I researched, I don't know if they went to Carthage or if these were ones who were left behind, but they were sold into slavery. And so, despite all the destruction, Alexander chose to spare those who sought sanctuary in the temple of Melkart. So he honored the gods. That was one of the characteristics as he traveled. And the king of the city actually was in there and he didn't kill him. Okay, so he went down from there, and then you can see Gaza. So he goes down to Gaza. And when he had destroyed Tyre and he got to Gaza, um, the Gaza fairly quickly capitulated. They had some resistance, though. It was heavily fortified. It was built on a hill, and so it and surrounded by walls, and it required a siege, and there were high walls. His engineers told him that because of the height of the mound, because of the height of the hill, it would be impossible to get through those walls. Well, that Alexander took as a challenge. And so he decided all the more he was going to make an attempt. So he made three unsuccessful assaults, and that's when it fell, but not before Alexander had received a serious shoulder wound. So he was injured there. Um, and as in Tyre, men of military age were put to the sword, were killed, some crucified, and the women and children were sold into slavery. And so he continued on down. Um, And you can see Ashdod, Philistia, and then this is God speaking. I'll take the blood from their mouths, the forbidden food from between their teeth. They were eating food sacrificed to idols. Those who are left will belong to our God and become a clan in Judah, and Akron will be like the Jebusites. And that happened. But I will encamp at my temple to guard it against marauding forces. Okay, so now God is promising he's going to protect Jerusalem. Okay, so let's see what happens. Okay, so this is from the text commentary. So if you're using the Blue Letter Bible, this is the kind of thing that you can see. Okay, this is Josephus's account of Alexander's meeting with the high priest. Okay, the so in Zechariah we had read that God would protect, and here it's using a different translation. I will camp around my house because of the army, because of him who passes by. Okay, so Alexander had had a dream before he left on his conquest. And it was a dream in which he saw the high priest. He saw a man, he didn't know it was the high priest, walking out in a robe that was blue and white, with a very identifiable mitre on his head, a hat, um, and a crowd of people walking behind him in white robes. Okay, well, what he was seeing was the high priest coming out of Jerusalem, gates open, welcoming him to Jerusalem. And when he saw that vision in his dream, he felt confident that he would win when he went out on his conquest. So it was very key. Okay, um, so he now is on his way down towards Egypt, but notice he did not conquer or attack Jerusalem. Yet Jerusalem was directly in his path. If you're coming down the Levant, the eastern side of the Mediterranean, and after you've gone through Syria and you begin coming into Israel, you're going to get to Jerusalem before you can get to Egypt. Um, and so this is Josephus's account. Now, who is Josephus? Josephus was a Jew, and he was very enterprising. He was in captivity with the Romans, and actually, in all likelihood, would have been killed. But he had his wits about him, and he was selected by first Tiberius and then his son Titus to write the history of the Jews. And the reason this is in 70 AD, and the reason he was selected to do that was because Titus and Tiberius were convinced the Jews would be gone forever. And what the Romans would do when they conquered a people and basically decimated them, and in the case of the Jews, they took at least 1 million of the Jews as slaves to Rome. You can see that depicted on the side of the Arch of Titus. Um, and they didn't think there was ever going to be another Israel. They thought it was the end of everything. And so that people would know how great the Romans were, they would write the histories of the people that they had conquered. In other words, saying Rome is so much better than all of these other nations that we have conquered. Now, here's the history of the Jews. We conquered them, but so that they're not just a footnote in history, we want their history recorded. And so Josephus did that. He wrote the Antiquities, he wrote the Wars of the Jews, he wrote quite a bit. And he was actually a pretty decent historian. There are a few things that he made mistakes on, but very, very few. It was actually quite accurate. So Alexander, after he had taken Gaza, made haste to go up to Jerusalem. And then the high priest, and this is interesting, when he heard that, he was in agony. You can imagine, under terror, because listen, they had crucified people in Tyre. They had, when they conquered a city, the Greeks were pretty brutal on the soldiers. Um, and so he wasn't sure how he should meet the Macedonian. And of course, that's Alexander, um, because the king, it says, was displeased at his foregoing disobedience. So he basically commanded that the people should make supplications. So everybody pray and should join with him in offering sacrifices to God. Everybody pray to God, offer sacrifices. And they were begging God to protect that nation. Well, that's a good place to start. And to deliver them from the perils that were coming upon them, whereupon God warned him in a dream. Okay, so God speaks to the high priest in a dream, just as he had spoken to Alexander in a dream. Um, and uh, it was immediately after he had offered sacrifice. And the dream was this: take courage, adorn the city, in other words, dress it up, open the gates. All right, this is really a stupid plan. This is kind of like marching around Jericho. Okay, you're going to welcome the invader in. Um, and then it says that the rest appear in white garments. So everybody else is going to go out with white garments. But you and the priest, so the high priest and the other priest, should meet the king in habits proper to their order. So you're going to dress like priests. Um, and then he's saying, don't dread any ill consequences because the providence of God will prevent any ill consequences. They're not going to kill you, is what he's saying. Upon which, when he rose from his sleep, this high priest, he greatly rejoiced. So he believed it. So he had faith, and he declared to all the warning he had received from God, and according to the dream, he acted entirely, and so he waited for the coming of the king. So basically, they all set up, and their strategy was not, we're going to fight them off, we're going to close the gates, we're going to pour boiling oil on them, or anything. It was, we're going to open the gates, we're going to march out and meet Alexander the Great, which you recognize this was totally counterintuitive, completely stupid in an earthly sense. But in fact, it was brilliant from God's standpoint. And so it says, and when he understood that he was not far from the city, this is Alexander, he went out in procession with the priests and the multitude of the citizens. So as Alexander was getting close, the high priest goes out with this procession. Um, they and so they're saying this was very different from the way other nations had approached Alexander, and they got out to Sapphira, which translated in Greek signifies prospect. Okay, so the possibility now for something to happen, um, because now you have a prospect both of Jerusalem, of the temple, and when the Phoenicians and the Chaldeans that followed him thought they should have liberty to plunder the city, torment the high priest to death, which the king, okay, this is talking about the past. Um, when they were battling the Phoenicians and the Chaldeans who wanted to destroy them. So it says the very reverse of it happened for Alexander when he saw the multitude at a distance in white garments, while the priest stood clothed with linen, and the high priest in purple and scarlet clothing, with his mitre on his head, having the golden plate on which the name of God was engraved. He approached by himself. Okay, so Alexander gets off his horse and approaches all by himself, and he adores the name of God and salutes the high priest. Well, I said it got off his horse. Don't know if he got off his horse. The Jews also did all together with one voice salute Alexander and gather around him. Whereupon the kings of Syria and the rest were surprised at what Alexander had done, supposed him to be crazy, disordered in his mind. However, Parmenio, who was Alexander's second in command, alone went up to him and asked him how it came to pass that when all the others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews. To whom he replied, I didn't adore him, but that God who has honored him with that high priesthood. For I saw, note this very person in a dream in this very habit, very same dress, very same robes, when I was at Dios in Macedonia, so before he even left, who, when I was considering with myself how I might obtain the dominion of Asia, exhorted me to make no delay. So that's God who exhorted him to make no delay, but boldly to pass over to the sea thither, for that he would conduct my army and would give me dominion over the Persians. And whence it is that having seen no other in that habit, and now seeing this person in it and remembering my vision and the exhortation which I had in my dream, I believe that I bring this army under divine conduct. In other words, God is for me, and shall therewith conquer Darius and destroy the power of the Persians. Um, Darius, of course, was the king of the Persians, and destroy the power of the Persians, and that all things will succeed according to what is in my own mind. And when he had said this to Parmenio, his number two, and had given the high priest his right hand, the priest ran along by him, and he came into the city. And when he went up into the temple, he offered sacrifice to God according to the high priest's direction, and magnificently treated both the high priest and the priests. And when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, okay, so that's what we just read in Daniel 7, he supposed that he himself was the person intended. And as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. But the next day he called them to him and bade them ask what favors they pleased of him. Whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers and might pay no tribute on the seventh year. Okay, so can you see how phenomenal this was? That in fact, not only did they not get conquered and destroyed, but they were granted favor. And a key part of the favor was they could continue to live as Jews following the law, and that they would not have to pay tribute. They wouldn't have to pay taxes. It says he granted all they desired. And when they entreated him that he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their own laws also, he willingly promised to do hereafter what they desired. And when he said to the multitude that if any of them would enlist themselves in his army on this condition, in other words, they could continue to practice Judaism in the army, they could continue to dress and eat as they had, and that they should continue under the laws of their forefathers and live according to them. He was willing to take them with him. Many were ready to accompany him in his wars. Okay, so a miracle, an absolute miracle. And let me share again. They go back to Zechariah. Okay, so now we're back in Zechariah. Okay, and so what this is talking about then is God's protection. I will encamp at my temple, guard against marauding forces, basically Alexander the Great. Never again will an oppressor overrun my people, for now I am keeping watch. Okay, so that's the promise here in Zechariah. And it's incredibly powerful. And that is history. That is what happened. And Zechariah, was written several hundred years before Alexander's conquest. Now, next thing you have is rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Okay, so suddenly it jumps to Palm Sunday, where Jesus is announced as the coming Messiah. But this is in juxtaposition to Alexander the Great coming in with his armies on horseback. And he has conquered city after city after city. But now you have the Messiah, and everything is different. He comes ultimately as the conqueror, as the ruler, the ultimate ruler of the world, of the universe, of Jerusalem, of Judah, um, of the heart, of the soul. But he doesn't come on a horse. And, God had admonished the Jews not to trust in horses. Had the high priest trusted in the strength and the power of the Jews to fend off Alexander the Great, he would have lost. Instead, he won. It's and so you see the way that this is juxtaposed, where all of a sudden we're talking about a very different king and a very different kingdom. And this is the important one because this is God's kingdom. And notice as it continues on, I will take away the chariots from Ephraim. So it's not going to be the chariots, and Ephraim is the northern kingdom. The war horses from Jerusalem, the southern kingdom. The battle bow will be broken. In other words, it's not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. And he will proclaim peace to the nations. He will rule from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. That's the Euphrates River to the end of the earth. And as for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit. Return to your fortress, you prisoners of hope. Isn't that a great word? Prisoners of hope. Even now I announce that I will restore twice as much to you. I will bend Judah as I bend my bow, will fill it with Ephraim. I will rouse your son Zion against your son's Greece and make you like a warrior's sword. Okay, so now he's talking about things that hadn't happened yet at that time, obviously. So the first that would come would be Jesus riding in as the declared Messiah, and they welcomed him. And you recall the great welcome on Palm Sunday. And then 7 days later, they said, actually 6 days later, when given the choice, they said, crucify him, crucify him. Okay, they wanted a king like Alexander, but he wasn't a king like Alexander. He wasn't going to be a ruler like Alexander. Um, but this was his first coming when he came first to die, and then he will return. But in this section here, it speaks about what is going to happen to Israel, to Judah, and to Ephraim. And there will be a time when they are powerful once again, very powerful. I will rouse your son Zion against your son's Greece and make you like a warrior's sword. And that, of course, is what has happened. In today's world, we see Israel as a mighty power. It is likely the second strongest military in the world and has actually more battle experience, particularly their Air Force, than almost any other nation. Now, more recently, obviously, Ukraine has a good deal of experience. And now it looks like Ukraine is coming in on the side of Israel and the United States in the war against Iran. But isn't it interesting that the fight is still against Persia, Iran? Um, and you see here this change. God is protecting Israel and continues to protect them. A few weeks back, we looked at all the miracles that happened in the War of Independence, in the Six-Day War, in the Yom Kippur War. Unbelievable things. And likewise, those things continue to happen today. And Israel will be protected and Israel will continue to stand. But we're also seeing that the nations of the world are turning against Israel. And there is a significant contingent here in the United States turning against Israel. It's amazing that on October 7th, the evil, evil, evil attack that happened, the horrible, horrible things that they did coming from Gaza when Hamas invaded. And it was on a day when, the Jews would least expect it. And um, the Jews obviously responded. And they're dealing with a group that chooses to hide behind women and children. And they do all in their power to try to make sure, Hamas does all in their power to try to make sure that there are those who die who are totally innocent because they have a story to tell. And they overstate pretty substantially those who have died. And so the world, after the genocide, intended genocide of Hamas killing Jews, um, Israel is the one now who's described as committing a genocide. Well, when you begin investigating the stories, uh, it's it's not that at all. I mean, how many nations in the history of the world send leaflets and radio broadcasts in advance to say, this is where we're going to be attacking tomorrow, and warning people to get out of harm's way. And how many people, how many nations carefully care for the wounded of their enemies. It's an amazing thing, but Israel gets a lot of bad press. It's not that they're perfect, but they get a lot of bad press. And here in America, we have so many who are still chanting from the river to the sea. In other words, we got to get the Jews out of Israel. They can't live there at all. Um, and sadly, in some of the elections, you have people winning who are really antagonistic to the Jews and saying horrible things, not just about Israel, but about the Jews. So, if we continue on in Zechariah, then the Lord will appear over them. His arrow will flash like lightning. The sovereign Lord will sound the trumpet. He will march in the storms of the south, and the Lord Almighty will shield them. They will destroy and overcome with sling stones. They will drink and roar as with wine. They will be full like a bowl used for sprinkling the corners of the altar. The Lord their God will save his people on that day as a shepherd saves his flock. They will sparkle in his hand like jewels in a crown. How attractive and beautiful they will be. Grain will make the young men thrive, and new wine the young women. So, what you have in Israel today is you have a warrior nation, and they are uh, um, militarily advanced, they are scientifically advanced, they are well ahead of others. They had an iron dome um, long before any other nation, before the United States. Now, we provided help to them in implementing these things, but they have weathered the most incredible attacks. You can recall the day a few years ago where there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of missiles that shot at them, and only a handful got through. I mean, these are amazing times. And when you see what's happening in Israel, recognize that every day Israel is in the news. This little nation, we have maybe 6, 7 million people, they're in the news. Actually, it's more than that with the Arabs, but I mean, that live there. But they're in the news. So Zechariah, written 500 years ago, actually more than that, 500 years before Christ, so 2,500 years ago, these things are being fulfilled today. It's amazing stuff.